greatest queens to ever rule over England was Queen Elizabeth I, a woman who defeated the Spanish Armada and dealt with Mary, Queen of Scots, her biggest threat, brutally. Her reign saw a huge boom in culture, and her people even became known as Elizabethans. Elizabeth reigned for a number of decades, and she did have many issues to deal with throughout her reign, from smallpox, which threatened her life, to the quest to find a husband or a man to create an heir with. She became the final Tudor queen as she chose to be married to her country rather than one of the impressive suitors who tried to capture her eye. But in 1603, the queen died, and she was greatly mourned by the people of England as they were heartbroken. Many had only ever known one woman to have reigned over them, similar to how most Brits felt when Elizabeth II, the Queen, died a few years ago. Elizabeth I was laid to rest inside of a burial vault within Westminster Abbey. However, her vault has been opened a number of times, but what was found? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. In the morning of the 24th of March 1603, Elizabeth I died. In her final months she had suffered significantly with depression and illness, and she saw many of her friends die, and she struggled to come to terms with this. She died at a rather grand age by the standards of the Tudor period, and had battled smallpox and other diseases as well. However, the court of the Queen didn't know what to do following her death, but in her last few days she had invited the Scottish King James to take the throne of England to unite the two nations. James was actually the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, who Elizabeth had executed. Elizabeth's final days were known to have been rather dour, especially as she spent long periods of time contemplating her life and the mistakes that she had made. She was almost 70 years old when she took to her deathbed, and she was surrounded by her remaining closest friends and her advisers, and also some of her servants. The Archbishop of Canterbury was there also for her, and he gave the Queen spiritual guidance in her final moments, and he told her that she would one day rule again as a queen in heaven. But Elizabeth seemed to accept death well, but her throat did swell, and she struggled to breathe and also to speak. Now Elizabeth did leave some instructions as to what should happen to her body after her death. She did not want to be disemboweled, which was part of the embalming process, but the royal doctors and physicians chose to ignore this, and they would be a good job, as they removed some of the Queen's vital organs. They removed her heart and entrails from her body, and these were placed into a separate chest after her death. Her body was prepared for burial in the same way as it had been for centuries. It was embalmed, wrapped in many layers of cerecloth, a heavy wax-coated cloth or shroud. Elizabeth I was placed inside of a large lead-lined coffin, which was decorated with Tudor imagery, such as the rose, and when the time came for her funeral procession from Richmond Palace to the place of her death, the central London, there was a huge spectacle. The coffin was covered in black velvet, and her ladies kept a close eye on it. It was claimed during the funeral procession that the oars at every stroke did tears let fall, and it was a very sorry sight. One onlooker wrote of the funeral procession that began on the 28th of April 1603 that the city of Westminster was surcharged with a multitude of all sorts of people in their streets, houses, leads, and gutters, that came to see the obsequies. There was such a general sighing, groaning, and weeping, as the like has not been seen or known in the memory of man. Her funeral effigy, a lifelike wax and wood model of her, was on top of the coffin, dressed in her Parliament robes, and on top of the effigy's head was a crown, holding the sceptress of power. For many, this was the first time they'd seen what their queen looked like. The coffin got to Westminster Abbey, and the service for the funeral was conducted by Dean Andrews, and after this the coffin of Elizabeth was taken to the Lady Chapel for burial. She was, to begin with, actually buried within the same vault as her grandparents, King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, the founders of the Tudor dynasty, which was said to have been a great honour, right at the centre of the Lady Chapel. But years later her body was moved out of here. It was her successor, James I of England, who did this, but he respected Elizabeth and wanted to pay homage and respect to her reign, and he commissioned a huge tomb to be made in her honour. This tomb was colossal and would have cost a fortune, and it was placed in a new burial spot above the burial vault of Mary I, the half-sister of Elizabeth. Now, Elizabeth's coffin was placed directly on top of Mary's coffin to show her significance and dominance over Mary, even in death. The tomb today shows Elizabeth I in a recumbent pose, and when you're in the room it is remarkable. However, in 1880, a book was published by Arthur Stanley, the Dean of Westminster, and he had explained the royal burial vaults within Westminster Abbey. He had been given by Queen Victoria permission to map the abbey and locate the sites of royal coffins, and was in particularly interested in finding the coffin of King James I. He found this within Henry VII and Elizabeth of York's vault, meaning that he had moved Elizabeth out of the vault so that one day he could be buried within it. But Stanley explored many of the other chambers and vaults, and he found an aisle underground at the east end of the tomb of Elizabeth I, and he followed it, finding a small opening in the wall, where he crept through. He then entered the burial vault of Elizabeth I and Mary I. He described what he saw and stated, "The excavations, however, had almost laid bare to the wall immediately at the eastern end of the monument of Elizabeth, and through a small aperture a view which was obtained into a long narrow vault imminently beneath her tomb. It was instantly evident that it enclosed 2 coffins and 2 only, and it could not be doubted that these contained Elizabeth and her sister Mary, the upper one larger and more distinctly shaped in the form of the body, like that of Mary Queen of Scots, rested on the other. There was no disorder or decay, except the centring wood had fallen over the head of Elizabeth's coffin, and that the wood case had crumbled away at the sides, and had drawn away part vault of the decaying lid. No coffin plate could be discovered, but fortunately the dim light fell on a fragment of the lid slightly carved. This led to a further search, and the original inscription was discovered. There was the Tudor badge, a full double rose, deeply but simply incised in outline on the middle of the cover. On each side the august initials E.R., and below the memorable date 1603. The coffin lid had been further decorated with narrow, moulded panelling. The coffin case was of inch elm, but the ornamental lid containing the inscription and panelling was of fine oak, half an inch thick, laid on the inch elm cover. The whole was covered with red silk velvet, of which much remained attached to the wood, and it had covered not only the sides and ends, but also the ornamented oak cover, as though the bare wood had not been thought rich enough without the velvet. The sight of this secluded and narrow tomb, thus compressing in the closest grasp the 2 Tudor sisters, partners of the same throne and grave, sleeping in the hope of resurrection. The solemn majesty of the great Queen, thus reposing, as can hardly be doubted by her own desire, on her sister's coffin, was the more impressive from the contrast of its quiet calm with the confused and multitudinous decay of the Stuart vault, and the fullness of its tragic interest with the vacancy of the deserted space which had been hereto explored in other parts of the chapel. The vault was then immediately closed. This was, it's believed, the first and only time that the burial vault of Queen Elizabeth I was opened, and it has never since been entered allegedly. There was a story about a young altar boy who once allegedly touched the box inside of the vault containing Elizabeth's heart, but this is disputed. However, within the heart of Westminster Abbey, Elizabeth I is still buried, and her coffin has never been opened, meaning that still today her body may be remarkably preserved and well protected from the elements. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.